Tonight, we slip back to a May afternoon teetering between war and birth when maps were about to be redrawn and a phone call could change a country's fate. You find yourself in a room without clocks, the windows shuttered against the clamor outside. The air is heavy with cigarette smoke, typewriter clatter and urgency, the kind that grips you by the collar and doesn't let go. Outside, the British are packing their bags. The Union Jack over Jerusalem is coming down in less than 24 hours. There are no peacekeepers on the horizon, just rumors of tanks gathering at borders and diplomats refreshing their telegram lines. This is the moment before Israel exists, but not before the debate. Should the new state even be called Israel, Judea, Zion, what about its borders? And would any major power actually recognize it? That recognition, by the way, will need to come fast, because if nobody with influence steps forward to say, yes, this country exists, then the bombs that are likely coming will fall on a political ghost. You probably won't survive this one, not if you're depending on diplomatic protocol and leisurely decision-making, especially not with the US State Department dragging its heels like a sulky teen asked to wash the dishes of history. And yet somehow this story ends with a signature delivered before lunchtime. But let's not skip ahead. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know what time is it where you are. Drop your location and local time in the comments below. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The morning of May 14, 1948 begins with tension, so thick you could butter toast with it. In Tel Aviv, crowds whisper nervously near the Museum of Art, though nobody's sure what kind of art will be displayed there later today. Word is something monumental is about to be announced. But the city's mood is an anxious cocktail of pride and terror, stirred with a dash of disbelief. Trucks with hastily painted license plates move quietly along the outskirts. Posters appear overnight with strange slogans. In the cafes, everyone knows something and nobody says anything. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, British soldiers are getting ready to leave. They've held the mandate since 1920, but now exhausted by riots, revolts, and the unsolvable puzzle of Palestine, they're about to clock out for good. Midnight will mark the official end. No transitional authority, no UN enforcement, just a vacuum, which in geopolitics is like leaving a pie on the windowsill during bear season. The Jewish leadership, Ben-Gurion and his team, know they need to fill that vacuum immediately, not next week, not tomorrow, but before a single Arab army gets its boots over the threshold. But how do you declare a country on a Friday afternoon and not get trampled by 5 furious neighbors by sundown? Simple, you make sure a big global player recognizes you. And that's why, while the Declaration of Independence is still being fine-tuned, word by word, clause by clause, another group is frantically wiring Washington, D.C., hoping that President Harry Truman will do something bold, something fast, something nobody really expects. The reality, though, is that Truman is not sitting with a pen in hand and a warm, fuzzy feeling about the birth of Israel. He's stuck in the middle of a bureaucratic dogfight. His own State Department has warned him again and again, don't do it. Recognizing a Jewish state will alienate Arab oil producers. It'll make the Soviet Union look like the more measured party. It could trigger a war. It could cost the US dearly. And frankly, it doesn't help that nobody knows what the new state will be called, where its borders actually are, or who's in charge. Still in a modest home in Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion leans over a cluttered table and stares at a draft declaration. His glasses fog a little from the heat and tension. The text still has placeholders, things like the Jewish state name to be determined. That's not ideal for an official document, and yet there's no time left. Every extra sentence is one less minute to call DC. In a moment of hurried consensus, the name is chosen. Israel. It's short, biblical, broad enough to avoid immediate fights over whether Judea or Zion excludes certain people or territories. It's the kind of name you pick, not because it solves everything, but because it offends slightly fewer people than the other options. But even as they prepare to read it aloud, everyone in the room knows it won't matter unless someone powerful says it matters. Otherwise, this declaration will be just another page in the long, crumpled archive of failed statehood attempts. And the British, they're certainly not staying to chaperone. By late morning, messengers are sent, wires tapped and fingers crossed. Across the Atlantic, it's still early in Washington. There's no guarantee Truman is even awake yet, let alone ready to act. The question is, will the leader of the free world hit yes before somebody else hits invade? Down a quiet Tel Aviv street shaded by dusty palms and low stucco walls, there's a house that doesn't look like it's about to birth a nation. No flags, no security gates, just a squat little building with too many people inside and too few chairs to sit on. But walk through the front door, duck your head into the basement, and suddenly you're standing at the very heart of Israel's coming out party. It's not much of a party though. The ceiling is low, the air is warm, and every surface is covered in paper. The only thing louder than the debate is the rattling typewriter spitting out drafts like some caffeinated prophet. David Ben-Gurion, short, square-shouldered and already balding, more from stress than age, leans over a wooden desk. He's not smiling. You wouldn't be either. He's trying to wrangle a Declaration of Independence that satisfies secular Jews, Orthodox rabbis, left-wing, Zionists, right-wing, nationalists, European exiles, Middle Eastern immigrants, and one or two wandering American supporters with loud opinions and louder ties. No pressure. Around him, his colleagues argue in Hebrew, Yiddish, German, and the occasional English curse word. Someone wants to include God in the declaration. Someone else says, absolutely not, this is a modern state, not a theocracy. One faction wants borders explicitly defined. Another insists leaving them out will prevent early wars. Spoiler, it doesn't. And then there's the phrasing, do they call it a Jewish state, state of the Jews, or just Israel? Each version implies something slightly different. Historians still argue whether the choice of language tilted the early perception of Israel more toward ethnicity or civic nationalism. But for now, Ben-Gurion snaps the group back to order with that famous school principal glare of his. They have hours, not days. The British leave tonight, and the moment they go, Arab armies will not politely wait for introductions. The declaration has to be typed, signed, and read before sunset, because once Shabbat begins, most of the Jewish signatories will refuse to lift a pen. And so the Tel Aviv typewriter becomes the beating heart of history. It's loud, it jams a lot, and its ribbon is practically coughing up ink, but it's also their only hope of organizing the future on paper before the past catches up with them in blood. At one point, the typist has to retype an entire page because someone decided a comma was too assertive, not a metaphor, an actual comma. This is what founding a country looks like: heated debates about punctuation while the city waits for air raid sirens. Upstairs, someone keeps checking the shortwave radio for news, British troop movements, Arab League statements, Washington gossip. Most of it is bad. Egypt's army is massing at the border. Jordan's Arab Legion is rumored to be eyeing Jerusalem. Syria's generals have stopped pretending they're not coming. And Lebanon, small but irritable, has decided it wants in on whatever's about to happen. And all of them, every single neighboring country, has made it clear that if the Jews declare a state, there will be war, not political snubs, not strongly worded letters, actual shooting war. But here in this basement, nobody has time to panic. Someone brings in sandwiches, someone else knocks over tea. A chair collapses under the weight of a second-hand map, showing vague British administrative zones. And all the while, that typewriter hammers on, clattering out a document that feels half like scripture, half like gamble. And maybe it is both, because even as Ben-Gurion nods at the final draft, even as he straightens his jacket and prepares to declare Israel to the world, there's a collective understanding in the room that this is only the beginning. Outside Tel Aviv buzzes in a strange hush. People have heard something big is coming, but they don't know what it is yet. Shops open nervously, then close again by mid-morning. Radios are turned up, even though there are no bulletins. Children are told to stay indoors after lunch. And on the outskirts of town, volunteers dig makeshift trenches. You wouldn't know it walking down the beach promenade, but by the end of the day, the entire region will be at war. In Jerusalem, the last British officials are quietly wrapping up decades of empire with a stiff upper lip. and a few sarcastic telegrams. Somewhere near Jaffa, a group of Jewish fighters is stashing old Czech rifles under crates of oranges. And back in the Tel Aviv basement, a declaration is being loaded into an envelope. It's been read, debated, edited, approved, and now it's final. Well, as final as it gets when there's no actual government yet, or functioning army, or defined territory, or currency, but hey, details. The declaration won't be made public until 4 p.m. sharp, just a couple hours before Shabbat. But before that, a small team is already moving behind the scenes. They need one thing more than even the ink on the page: recognition. Someone somewhere has to say, this newborn country is real. And the best candidate, President Harry S. Truman, sitting in his office in Washington, probably unaware that a small packet of history is already en route to his desk. There's no backup plan, no alternative route, just this: a document typed in a basement, carried in haste, bound for a president who may or may not even take the meeting. And you standing there among the piles of crumpled drafts and tea-stained maps can't help but feel it, the deep electric crackle of a country being willed into existence, not with weapons, but with stubborn, sleep-deprived resolve. Now shift your gaze across the Atlantic to Washington, D.C., where it's still the early hours of May 14th. The sun is gently filtering through the blinds in the Oval Office, where President Harry S. Truman is trying to catch up on paperwork, but his mind isn't entirely on it. His desk is cluttered not with flowers and well wishes from Middle Eastern hopefuls, but with memos, warnings, and one very persistent diplomatic migraine. The Arab League has made its intentions known. The State Department has issued formal objections. His own Secretary of State, George Marshall, a man who basically helped win World War II, is warning him that recognizing a Jewish state could be catastrophic for America's position in the Middle East. Oil access, military bases, alliances, it's all on the line. So what does Truman do? He opens the door to a man who isn't a diplomat. He isn't a general. He isn't even a government official. He's a former haberdasher from Missouri, like Truman himself, who now owns a clothing store. His name is Eddie Jacobson, and his only real political asset is the fact that he and Truman used to sell shirts together. No joke. But Eddie has something nobody else in Washington has: Truman's ear. And he's about to use it. Eddie Jacobson doesn't barge into the Oval Office. That would be rude. He simply walks in, invited, yes, but very determined. He's carrying no official document, no party line endorsement, just a deep personal plea. The Jewish people, he tells Truman, need a homeland now, not later, not once the committees have finished their tea. The Holocaust is barely over, and the refugee camps in Europe are overflowing with the broken, the displaced, and the desperate. They need a home, they need safety, they need recognition. And that's when he pulls out the map. Not a shiny, official Rand McNally print, a hand-drawn one, sketchy, messy, lovingly desperate. It shows the outlines of Palestine, the proposed Jewish territories, and a few hopeful arrows where refugees might land. The kind of map that smells like coffee and 1,000 sleepless nights. Truman doesn't say anything right away. He just looks. Long enough for Jacobson to wonder if he's already lost him. But Truman is remembering not the map, not the policy memos, but something deeper. He's thinking of pogroms, of gas chambers, of a world that stood by too long. And he's thinking, maybe, just maybe, this is the one thing he can do now that might actually make a difference. But let's not paint Truman as a flawless hero. He's annoyed. He's tired. He's being pulled in 5 different directions by the State Department, the Defense Department, oil executives, British diplomats, and his own advisors. He doesn't even know what the proposed state will be called yet. In fact, one of his top staffers has written in a memo that he should wait until a formal request comes in, complete with the official name, borders, and leadership structure. Truman reads the memo, sighs, and leaves it on his desk like a half-solved crossword. Here's the quirky part. One of the reasons Truman is even willing to listen to Jacobson is because of a falling out he had with Chaim Weizmann, a prominent Zionist leader. Weizmann had tried to push for an early meeting with Truman through the usual formal channels. Truman didn't appreciate the pressure. But Jacobson, he walked in as a friend, not a lobbyist. He didn't play politics. He appealed to something older, softer, Truman's conscience. Historians still debate whether Truman made up his mind in that moment. Some say he had already decided days earlier, and Jacobson was just the cherry on the decision cake. Others argue that without Jacobson, Truman might have waited, and that even a few hours' delay could have changed everything. But one thing's clear: after that meeting, the wheels began to turn fast. Truman asked his staff to prepare a draft recognition letter, not for some hypothetical country in the Middle East, but for the Jewish state of Israel, a nation not yet born. Meanwhile, back in Tel Aviv, the team around Ben-Gurion doesn't know any of this. For all they know, Truman might be playing poker, or feeding his dog, or pacing the Oval Office, wondering whether to go with State of Judea or Land of Not Quite Yet. They don't even know if their cable will make it. That's the gamble. Everything depends on a telegram reaching Washington and a president who's willing to ignore half his own government before lunch. But Truman, in classic Midwestern fashion, keeps things close to the vest. Even his press secretary doesn't know what's going on. When asked by reporters about the U.S. position on the matter, he just mumbles something vague about pending developments and ducks into another meeting. Behind the scenes, though, the official recognition statement is being typed, tweaked, and prepared to drop the moment Israel's declaration goes live. And here's a little-known detail: there was a draft of the U.S. recognition letter with a blank space where the country's name was supposed to go. Yes, a blank. Because nobody was 100% sure whether it would be Israel Judea or something entirely different. The final version was only completed minutes before it went out once the name Israel was confirmed. The typist inserted it at the last second. Bureaucracy with a heartbeat. Outside the White House, the cherry blossoms have already started to fall. The city is easing into a humid spring afternoon, and yet inside those white stone walls, something monumental is being decided by a president, a childhood friend, and a world that isn't quite ready for what's about to happen. You've probably never had to overrule your entire foreign policy team before breakfast, but that's exactly the kind of day Harry Truman is having. If the president had wanted a peaceful May morning, maybe filled with coffee and a bit of light reading, someone forgot to tell the State Department. Because the moment word got out that Truman might recognize a Jewish state, his own administration turned into a slow-motion rebellion. George Marshall, the legendary Secretary of State, yes, the one with a whole post-war recovery plan named after him, was furious, not annoyed, not skeptical, full-on, vein on the forehead, furious. At one point in a closed-door meeting, Marshall even threatened that if Truman recognized the Jewish state, he might not vote for him in the next election. Let that sink in. The man who won the war for Roosevelt and helped write the future of Europe is threatening not to vote for his own president over one diplomatic decision. And he wasn't alone. The vast majority of Truman's foreign policy team, from ambassadors to analysts, agreed that recognition was too risky. They warned it would provoke a massive Arab backlash, that the US might lose access to critical oil supplies, that it could draw the Soviet Union into the region or even cause a broader regional war. Some even feared that America's credibility as a neutral broker in the Middle East would be destroyed forever. That last one might have been prophetic, but Truman had a habit of ignoring advice that sounded like fear. He called it plain speaking. His critics called it reckless. And on this day, plain speaking is about to win. Still, it's not easy. The pressure is intense. The British ambassador is politely fuming. The Arab delegations in Washington are drafting letters of protest before they've even seen a final announcement. Truman's own party leaders are split, afraid of alienating either side in an election year. It's the kind of environment where most presidents would smile, issue a vague statement, and kick the decision 6 months down the road. Not Truman. He calls a secret meeting with his inner circle, the kind where people sit stiffly and pretend not to notice the stack of ignored cables building on his desk. He listens, nods, asks a few questions, and then very quietly tells them to prepare the statement of recognition, one that names the Jewish state of Israel by name the moment it declares independence. The letter is to be ready and waiting, no more delays. And crucially, no waiting for State Department sign-off. This in presidential terms is a mic drop. But just to make it even more dramatic, let's rewind for a moment to the source of all this pushback oil. Because the real reason the State Department is spooked isn't about maps or morality, it's petroleum. At the time, the US is still heavily dependent on Middle Eastern oil, especially from Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, along with the rest of the Arab League, has made it clear that recognizing a Jewish state might as well be an act of betrayal. This is also the early Cold War. Remember, the Soviets are watching every American move with binoculars and popcorn, waiting to step in and play the hero if the US fumbles the handoff. In fact, here's a wild detail. The Soviet Union had actually been the first major power to publicly support the UN partition plan in 1947. That's right. The same Soviet Union that would later arm some of Israel's enemies initially said, "Sure, give the Jews a homeland." Historians still argue whether Stalin was genuinely sympathetic or just trying to mess with the British one last time before the mandate ended. Anyway, back in Washington, Truman's team is now split. His Secretary of State is incandescent with rage. His political advisors are biting their fingernails. And yet a few quiet voices in the room urge him to go ahead. Not for votes, not for oil, not for chessboard diplomacy, but because it's the right thing to do. One of them is Clark Clifford, a relatively junior White House counsel who goes toe-to-toe with George Marshall in that now infamous meeting. Clifford lays out the case, moral obligation, the horrors of the Holocaust, the opportunity to back a democracy in a turbulent region. Marshall fumes, but Truman listens. And in that moment the course is set. Now if you think it's strange that the birth of a modern country hinged on a shouting match in a Washington office, you're not wrong. It's absurd. But it's also very human. Behind every headline are egos, loyalties, fears and friendships. Truman isn't driven solely by politics. He's a man who read reports about concentration camps, who saw the photos, who spoke with survivors. He knows what's at stake, not just for Jewish refugees, but for America's conscience. Still, he plays his cards close. Publicly, there's no confirmation, no press release. Even the recognition letter itself remains in draft form, sitting quietly on a typist's desk, like a loaded pistol under glass, just in case the declaration in Tel Aviv actually happens. And then there's the ultimate irony. All the while, some officials at the State Department are still hoping the Jewish leadership will delay. Maybe Ben-Gurion will hesitate. Maybe the Arabs will make a counteroffer. Maybe, just maybe, Washington won't have to take a side today. But they're out of time. In just a few hours, David Ben-Gurion will step up to a lectern in the Tel Aviv Museum of Art and say the words that officially announce the rebirth of the Jewish homeland. And 11 minutes after that, Truman will sign the piece of paper that nearly tore his government in half. And through it all, the State Department will be left blinking in disbelief, wondering how, after all the memos and meetings, the president still managed to beat them to the punch. And so we arrive at the afternoon of May 14th, 1948 in Tel Aviv, a Friday teetering between daylight and destiny. The streets have quieted in that eerie way cities sometimes do before something huge happens. Shopkeepers are pulling down their shutters early. Radios are crackling with static and breathless speculation. And on Rothschild Boulevard, a modest white building, once the home of the Tel Aviv Museum of Art, is now the most important address in the Jewish world. Inside, it's standing room only. The walls are decorated with a few borrowed paintings which look awkward and out of place, like guests at a wedding who weren't told the dress code. Rows of chairs are packed with dignitaries, party officials, journalists, and a handful of military men who might be needed sooner than they think. There's no orchestra, no confetti, no time. Every minute counts because sunset is coming, and with it, the Jewish Sabbath. According to Jewish law, once Shabbat begins, observant Jews cannot sign documents. And nearly half the people expected to put their names on the Declaration of Independence are religiously observant. That means the whole thing, speech, declaration, signatures, has to be done and dusted before the sun dips below the Mediterranean horizon. Oh, and ideally before the Egyptian Air Force starts bombing the building, because that's also a real possibility. At precisely 4:00 p.m., David Ben-Gurion, dressed in a modest dark suit with his wild white hair only slightly tamed, steps up to the podium. There's no microphone boom, just one microphone actually borrowed from the local radio station. He clears his throat and begins to read. The declaration is bold, eloquent, and stitched together from weeks of compromise. It opens with ancient ties to the land, acknowledges the horrors of the Holocaust, and declares the establishment of a Jewish state in the land of Israel to be known as the State of Israel. The moment he says the name, the room exhales. It's done. The name is real now. Not Judea, not Zion, not the Jewish Commonwealth, just Israel. As if it had always been that way. A cheer rises in the room, not wild applause, more like the exhausted relief of people who've held their breath for decades. The document is signed quickly by 37 members of the Jewish National Council, some using Hebrew signatures, others in Roman letters. One signatory stuck behind enemy lines in besieged Jerusalem has his name left blank. With a line drawn in its place, he'll sign it later. As the last ink dries, Ben-Gurion announces that the declaration will go into effect at midnight when the British mandate officially ends. The moment Israel comes into being, its army, such as it is, will be born too. And with it, war. Because no one in that room believes for a second that the Arab world will shrug and say, well, congratulations, best of luck with your new country. They expect war. In fact, they know it's already on the way. The only question is whether the bombs will fall before or after dinner. Outside, people pour into the streets. Some dance, some cry, some just stand still stunned. In cafes, radios announce the declaration in shaky tones, followed by a patriotic song or two, before cutting to emergency bulletins. Synagogues begin to fill early. Families light Shabbat candles with trembling hands. Tel Aviv's air raid sirens remain silent for now, but people start taping up their windows anyway. Meanwhile, in a sealed diplomatic pouch, a copy of the declaration, translated and trimmed for official eyes, is already making its way to Washington, D.C., but there's a problem. Time zones. Because while it's now late afternoon in Tel Aviv, it's still morning in Washington. That means the Israeli delegation doesn't just have to declare independence, they have to catch the White House staff before they go to lunch. Enter Eliyahu Epstein, Israel's unofficial envoy to the United States. He's been operating out of a hotel room because Israel doesn't actually have an embassy yet. For the past 48 hours, he's barely slept, surviving on strong coffee and stronger nerves. The moment Ben-Gurion declares independence, Epstein sends a telegram to the White House with one clear request: formal recognition of the State of Israel, not next week, not later that day, immediately. Why? Because recognition gives a newborn country legitimacy. And legitimacy in international law is a kind of shield-thin shore, but better than nothing when the tanks start rolling. The race is on. While the telegram zooms across cables and airwaves, Epstein tries to make sure that the request lands not in the slow, sticky hands of the State Department, but right on Truman's desk. Because if it gets waylaid, delayed, or rerouted, the recognition could come hours too late. And in those hours, Israel could be erased before it's even stamped into a passport. Back in the White House, a few staffers are already eyeing the clock. It's a Friday after all. The cafeteria has pot roast today, and nobody wants to be stuck dealing with another Middle East file before the weekend. But Truman has already told his inner circle the moment they get the official word from the Jewish leadership he wants to act. What's not clear, at least to most of Washington, is how fast he plans to act. The assumption is that it'll take at least a few hours, maybe a committee review, some interagency paperwork, a rubber stamp. That's how things usually work. But today, Harry Truman isn't feeling bureaucratic. He's feeling decisive. And so as Tel Aviv begins its cautious celebrations and Jerusalem prepares for shelling, a flurry of activity erupts in a small West Wing office. The telegram is received, the name Israel is confirmed, and the final draft of the US recognition letter is pulled from a file drawer, where it's been waiting, blank spot, filled in typos, fixed ready for history. All that remains is for the president to sign it, which, as you're about to see, he does just minutes later, well before the lunch trays even leave the kitchen. And then there it is, a simple piece of paper. Just a few sentences typed in the stiff, no-nonsense language of diplomacy. It begins with, "This government has been informed that a Jewish state has been proclaimed in Palestine and recognition has been requested by the provisional government thereof." Not exactly poetic, but that's how history often walks through the door, buttoned up and understated, wearing black-rimmed glasses. At precisely 6:11 p.m., Tel Aviv time, or 11:11 a.m. in Washington, D.C., President Harry S. Truman picks up a fountain pen, scratches his name across the bottom of the letter, and with that flourish, the United States becomes the first nation to officially recognize the State of Israel. 11 minutes, that's how long it took for one of the world's great powers to acknowledge the newest country on the map. Truman didn't wait for a committee, he didn't even wait for lunch. There were no press conferences, no podium fanfare, just one man in a modest West Wing office quietly making a choice that would ripple for decades. And here's the kicker: the White House press release actually went out before Israel's declaration had been broadcast around the world. So, in some corners, it looked like the US had recognized a country that technically hadn't quite been born yet. It was a race between fax machines and fate barely crossed the finish line first. Truman's decision caused an immediate political tremor. Journalists scrambled to confirm what they'd just read. The State Department was caught off guard. British officials were left blinking at their teacups, and the Arab League. Well, they didn't send thank you notes. In fact, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, who had been watching the clock just as closely, launched their invasion plans less than 24 hours later. Arab forces began moving into Palestine with coordinated attacks determined to destroy the new state before it could establish a foothold. The war that would become known as Israel's War of Independence started before the ink had time to dry. And yet in that fragile in-between moment after Truman's signature, and before the first bombs fell, something extraordinary happened. The Jewish people scattered across continents, ghettos and graveyards had a home again, a legal one, not just in their own eyes, but in the eyes of a superpower, a country that had survived ancient conquest, exile, persecution, pogroms and genocide, had reappeared blinking in the harsh daylight of modern geopolitics. Now it's easy to imagine Truman basking in the applause of history. But in truth, the president's decision was met with more backlash than bouquets. Arab nations cut diplomatic ties. American oil companies panicked. Even within his own administration, the mood was tense. Some saw Truman's move as impulsive, emotional, driven more by politics than policy. Others, especially within the Jewish community, saw it as nothing short of moral leadership. Truman himself didn't say much in the moment. He never claimed to be a prophet or a visionary. He just believed that the Jewish people had earned their place among the nations and that it was time someone said so out loud and in writing. Here's a quirky detail: the original recognition letter typed that morning spelled Israel's name, Israel. Yes, really. The world's first official recognition of the country misspelled it. The error was quickly caught and corrected, but somewhere out there, buried in a file drawer or museum archive, is a version of history where the newborn country was briefly recognized as Israel. Not quite the branding they were going for. And then there's Truman's own memory of that day. Years later, when asked about his decision, he reportedly said, "I had faith in Israel before it was established. I believe it has a glorious future before it, not just as another sovereign nation, but as an embodiment of the great ideals of our civilization." Sweet words, but not everyone was convinced. Historians still argue whether Truman acted out of political calculation, securing Jewish votes ahead of a tough election, or whether it was a deeply personal gesture shaped by conscience and Eddie Jacobson's quiet visit. Realistically, it was probably both. Meanwhile, in Tel Aviv, the news arrived with startling speed. The Americans had come through. People huddled around radios in bakeries and balconies heard the crackling words in disbelief. The United States has recognized the State of Israel. There was no champagne, no fireworks, just a collective exhale, followed by the quiet realization that celebration would have to wait. War was coming. Military units scrambled to organize, maps were pinned to walls. Young men and women, many of them Holocaust survivors with barely a few weeks of military training, were handed rifles and pointed toward the front. What passed for an air force included a handful of Czech aircraft and hastily recruited pilots who'd flown in World War II, some of whom hadn't even seen a cockpit in years. They weren't ready, but they had no choice. Even as shells began to fall on the outskirts of Jerusalem and convoys were ambushed in the Negev, Israel's leaders clung to one critical victory: they weren't alone. Truman's signature, however simple, meant something profound. It meant Israel could speak on the world stage without needing to shout. It meant someone believed they had a right to exist. The hours that followed would test that belief in ways no one could have imagined. But for now, in that sliver of calm between recognition and ruin, the people of Israel had something they hadn't had in 2,000 years: a place to call home and a friend to call it with. By nightfall on May 14th, the sky over Tel Aviv had begun to darken, not just with the coming of Shabbat, but with the unmistakable scent of something older, heavier war. The announcement had been made. Truman's recognition had arrived. Israel was on paper a state like any other, but unlike any other newborn country in recent memory, it was immediately surrounded by neighbors who didn't see it as a nation. They saw it as a threat to be eliminated by force. And they wasted no time. Even before the last blessings of the Sabbath were spoken over dinner tables, Arab armies were already in motion. Egypt crossed the southern border with tanks, armored vehicles, and air power. The Egyptian Air Force made its dramatic entrance by bombing Tel Aviv's central bus station, an attack that left dozens dead and served as the brutal start to what would become a full-scale war. Syrian troops poured in from the northeast, aiming for Galilee. Iraqi forces entered from the east, while Lebanese units snuck over from the north like the loudest surprise guests in diplomatic history. Jordan's Arab Legion, the best trained and equipped of them all, marched directly toward Jerusalem. Now here's a darkly ironic twist. The Arab League had actually warned in advance that if the Jews declared independence, they would invade. Everyone believed them. And yet the assumption, especially in London and Washington, was that such a move would scare the Zionists into delaying their plans. Instead, Ben-Gurion and his team stared down that warning and did it anyway. Some said it was courage. Others called it reckless. Historians still argue whether Israel would have survived at all had it waited even one more week. The attacks were fast, coordinated, and devastating. For a country less than 24 hours old, with no standing army, no formal military doctrine, and a patchwork collection of militias as its defense, it felt like trying to stand upright in a hurricane. The Haganah Palmach and Irgun Jewish paramilitary groups that had previously been more focused on British patrols and internal rivalries were now thrust together under one roof, unified by necessity. There was no room for ideological purity. If you could shoot, patch a wound, or fix a radio, you were in. And yet here's the strange part: the invaders expected a cakewalk. Many Arab leaders were convinced Israel wouldn't last a week. Egypt even printed newspapers declaring a decisive Arab victory before the battles had really begun. But those headlines would soon curdle into confusion, because what the Arab generals hadn't accounted for, what Truman's hurried recognition had helped spark, was Israel's resolve. And that resolve was forged not in the neat lines of traditional armies, but in the shadows of exile trauma and the kind of desperation that makes a person pick up a rifle and run toward artillery. Remember, many of Israel's early fighters weren't soldiers. They were tailors, bakers, teachers, Holocaust survivors whose training consisted of nothing more than a crash course in how to use a Lee Enfield rifle that still smelled like World War I. Some couldn't even understand the Hebrew commands being shouted at them. They just followed the man ahead and hoped he knew what he was doing. Still they held the line. Battles erupted in the north along the Galilee. Skirmishes tore through the Negev. In the south, Egyptian columns pushed relentlessly toward Tel Aviv, but were slowed by sabotage and fierce resistance. Jerusalem, ancient and divided, became a war zone of alleyways and rooftop snipers. Jewish neighborhoods were cut off, resupply convoys ambushed, and synagogues turned into bunkers. The fighting there was some of the bloodiest and most symbolic of the entire war. One of the more surreal images from those early days, Jewish fighters using a makeshift cannon assembled from parts of a British water pipe. They called it the Davidka, and it made a deafening roar so impressive that it often caused panic among Arab troops who assumed it was some terrifying new superweapon. In truth, the Davidka was wildly inaccurate and barely functional, but perception mattered, and in a war where morale was everything, it became a strange kind of talisman. Meanwhile, in Washington, Truman was dealing with the diplomatic fallout. Arab nations condemned his decision. Some newspapers called it a blunder. Others praised him for moral clarity. His own State Department grumbled into their martinis. But Truman didn't flinch. He had made the call, and now the new state had to defend itself or die. Back in Israel, the days blurred. Civilians were drafted overnight. Teenagers were sent to the front lines with barely a helmet and a sandwich. Women joined combat units, drove supply trucks, served as medics, and sometimes fought shoulder to shoulder in desperate firefight. The dead were buried quickly, often in mass graves. New soldiers were handed a rifle with one bullet and told to make it count. At one point, Israel had fewer than 5 tanks and just one functioning Spitfire aircraft, but somehow that was enough, barely. Foreign volunteers began to trickle in. Some were idealists, some were adventurers, some were just veterans looking for one last war. They came from America, South Africa, Canada, and even post-war Europe. Pilots especially were in high demand. After all, Israel had planes, but barely anyone to fly them. Enter a ragtag squadron of ex-WPO aviators, many of them Jewish Americans who had fought Hitler and now signed up to defend the Jewish state. They called themselves Mashal Foreign Volunteers. One such pilot joked that flying for Israel was just like flying for Uncle Sam, except your parachute was a prayer. The planes were old, the maps were hand-drawn, and yet somehow they took off and sometimes even landed. The war was brutal, ugly, and far more complicated than anyone had hoped. Civilians on both sides suffered. Villages were abandoned, captured, shelled. Refugees flooded the roads, Arab and Jewish alike. This wasn't a clean war of front lines and honor codes. It was messy, emotional, and fueled by generations of trauma. And through it all, Israel held. Barely miraculously, stubbornly. Thanks in part to foreign volunteers, thanks in part to Czech-supplied weapons that arrived just in time, but mostly thanks to the fact that when Truman signed that letter before lunch, he gave Israel something it had never had before: international legitimacy. And legitimacy, like armor, doesn't stop bullets, but it lets you stand a little straighter when the sky falls. If Section 7 left you standing on the battlefield, dust in your eyes, adrenaline humming, Section 8 takes you somewhere even stranger. The under-the-table arms deals and patched-together squadrons that kept Israel's heart beating during its first desperate months. Because while bullets were flying, so were ideas, often illegal, often improbable, often just barely effective. And yet somehow they worked. The fact is, Israel didn't win its war of independence with a well-oiled military machine. It won with spare parts, smuggled rifles, and a dose of absurd improvisation that wouldn't look out of place in a heist movie. Let's start with Czechoslovakia. Yes, that Czechoslovakia. In one of the Cold War's great ideological plot twists, a newly communist country in Eastern Europe under heavy Soviet influence became the first nation to supply arms to Israel. Why? Partly because the Soviets saw a chance to kick the British Empire in the teeth on its way out of Palestine, but also because Czechoslovakia had stockpiles of leftover German weapons, from WT Mauser rifles, machine guns, even Messerschmitt planes, and very few customers. Israel, desperate and willing to pay in whatever currency it could scrape together, became a grateful buyer. But moving those weapons wasn't exactly easy. The United Nations had imposed an arms embargo on the region. The US was still trying to pretend it hadn't picked a side. So Israel's agents, many of them European Jews who had barely survived the camps, set up secret deals, hidden warehouses, and fake cargo manifests. Rifles were disguised as agricultural tools. Ammunition was packed in boxes labeled plumbing supplies. At one point, disassembled aircraft parts were hidden in crates marked sewing machines. One of the most audacious operations involved flying planes directly from Czechoslovakia to Israel through hostile airspace across countries that would have grounded or arrested the pilots on the spot. The flights were long, the navigation primitive, and the fuel calculations terrifyingly tight. More than once, pilots landed in desert fields with their fuel gauges clanging on empty, greeted by teenagers with hand-painted signs that said runway in Hebrew and nothing else. These flights, code-named Operation Balak, delivered not only weapons but hope. And among the strangest of the Czech shipments were those German Messerschmitt planes that had once carried the swastika, now repainted with the blue Star of David. Historians still marvel at the irony. Survivors of the Holocaust flying Nazi planes to defend a Jewish state, it doesn't get more surreal than that. And speaking of surreal, let's talk about the pilots. Israel had almost no trained aviators at the start of the war. The few it had were mostly former Royal Air Force members or Haganah volunteers who'd been taught in makeshift training programs with manuals translated on the fly. So Israel put out a quiet call. Any Jews with flying experience were wanted. And many answered. A group of ragtag airmen from the US, Canada, and South Africa, many of them Jewish WBT vets, formed what would become the Israeli Air Force's first real combat wing. They flew whatever they could get their hands on, including cobbled-together Czech Messerschmitt's old C-46 transport planes and even a few cast-off B-17 bombers smuggled out of America under false pretenses. And yes, some of those flights broke US neutrality laws. Several pilots were arrested when they returned home. One was tried under the Neutrality Act, but most of them felt the risk was worth it. They weren't just flying missions. They were making history at 10,000 feet with leaky fuel lines and barely functioning radios. One pilot, Lou Lenart, famously led Israel's first airstrike on May 29, 1948, against an Egyptian armored column advancing toward Tel Aviv. The planes were held together with duct tape and sheer willpower, but the attack worked. The Egyptian advance slowed, then halted. Lenart would later say, "We were 5 guys in 4 junk airplanes. We stopped an entire army." Of course, not everything went smoothly. At one point, an Israeli air squadron dropped bombs on their own troops by mistake. Another time, a plane intended for bombing a Syrian position instead dropped its payload on an empty hill, startling a herd of goats and not much else. But these mishaps were outweighed by the moments of sheer improvisational brilliance. On the ground, too, Israeli forces were improvising constantly. Homemade armored vehicles were constructed by welding steel plates onto old buses and trucks called sandwich trucks because of the layers of protection. These Frankenstein monsters were slow, prone to overheating, and offered zero rear visibility, but they saved lives on the dangerous roads to Jerusalem. And while Tel Aviv and Haifa were on edge, the situation in Jerusalem was particularly grim. Arab forces had encircled the city, cutting off supplies. Water was rationed, food was running low. Israeli convoys trying to break the siege were ambushed again and again. So engineers carved out a back route, what came to be known as the Burma Road, a dirt path hacked through the Judean hills, often by hand, allowing vital supplies to sneak in under cover of darkness. Meanwhile, diplomacy continued behind the scenes. The Soviets, initially supportive of Israel's establishment, began to pull back as it became clear the new state would align more closely with the West. The British, bitter over how quickly the US had moved to recognize Israel, tried to avoid taking any position at all. And the United States, well after Truman's recognition, it largely stepped back, watching to see whether this tiny state would sink or swim. But recognition did more than just open a diplomatic door. It sent a message to allies, enemies, and the rest of the world that Israel wasn't going anywhere, that it was real, that its citizens, for all their chaos and shortages, weren't alone. And they weren't. Donations flowed in, volunteers arrived, Jewish communities from New York to Casablanca collected food, blankets, and medical supplies, and, slowly, painfully, Israel began to push back. Not with tanks because it barely had any, but with resolve. With foreign pilots who couldn't read Hebrew but flew low and fast, with rifles smuggled in through side ports, with a teenage radio operator who learned Morse code just in time to call in an airstrike that saved a whole battalion, with whatever was available. Because when your survival depends on it, even a pile of scrap metal can become a miracle. Let's rewind the tape just a little back before Truman's pen, back before the Czech rifles and the scrambled pilots, back to 1947, when the world's finest diplomats sat around a horseshoe of desks at the United Nations and tried to solve what they called the Palestine question. And in typical UN fashion, they came up with something that looked great on paper, but immediately fell apart in practice: the partition plan. The idea was deceptively simple. The British, exhausted and ready to drop the mandate like a hot latke, turned to the UN for help. After much debate, the UN Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP for the acronym LOVERS, proposed dividing the land into two states, one Jewish, one Arab, with Jerusalem as an international zone. 56% of the land would go to the Jews, despite them being a minority population, and 43% to the Arabs. 1% Jerusalem would belong to the world. Cue immediate chaos. The Jewish leadership, though not thrilled about the strange map, full of awkward borders, disconnected regions and highways slicing between ethnic enclaves, accepted the deal. Why? Because they knew it was the best offer they were ever going to get. Ben-Gurion famously said it was not perfect, but enough to build upon. The Arab leadership, however, rejected it outright. To them, the very idea of partition was a colonial absurdity. They didn't want half a homeland, they wanted all of it. And they made their position crystal clear: if partition passed, there would be war. And so on November 29, 1947, the UN voted. 33 nations voted yes, 13 voted no, and 10 abstained. The partition plan passed. Crowds of Jews danced in the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Arab cities fell silent, and across the Middle East riots erupted almost instantly. In the months that followed, civil war broke out between Jewish and Arab communities, even before the British had left. Convoys were ambushed, neighborhoods burned, and the idea of two peaceful states living side by side was buried under rubble before it ever had a chance. Here's a quirky side note. The map drawn by the UN looked like it had been sketched during a turbulent bus ride. Jewish and Arab territories zigzagged across the land with all the elegance of a spilled bowl of spaghetti. Jewish towns were surrounded by Arab villages, Arab cities were split by Jewish highways, and Jerusalem was to be administered by an international commission that had never been formed and had no actual enforcement power. Historians still argue whether the plan was naive, doomed by bad design, or deliberately crafted to make both sides equally unhappy. Whatever the intent, it failed almost immediately. Violence surged. The British, unwilling to enforce the plan they were technically babysitting, mostly stood back. One British officer reportedly told a journalist, "Our orders are to stay out of it until someone starts shooting at us." Spoiler, they did. By early 1948, the partition plan had become a theoretical footnote. Jewish forces were securing what territory they could. Arab militias, often better armed and supported by neighboring countries, attacked settlements and supply lines. No side waited for the British to leave, and no one followed the UN lines. And here's the irony: when Israel declared independence in May 1948, it did so without defining its borders. The Declaration of Independence, crafted with such care under Ben-Gurion's watchful eye, made no mention of specific territory. It referenced the UN plan, yes, but avoided committing to its bizarre cartography. Why? Because the Jewish leadership knew the map was already obsolete. What mattered now wasn't theoretical borders, it was survival. And that lack of borders became a defining feature of the state. From day one, Israel's boundaries were fluid, contested, and shaped by conflict rather than diplomacy. The war that followed redrew the map yet again. Territories changed hands. Cities were captured or lost. Armistice lines, not UN lines, became the new reality. And speaking of Jerusalem, remember that international zone the UN had dreamed of, where everyone could sip tea and share holy sites in peace. Yeah, that didn't happen. The city became the most fiercely contested battleground of the war. Jewish forces controlled the western part. Jordan's Arab Legion took the old city in the east. The holy city, instead of becoming a beacon of shared humanity, became a divided scar, barbed wire snipers, and broken promises. One particularly chilling event during this time was the siege of the Jewish quarter in the old city. Cut off and surrounded, the defenders held out with dwindling food, little water, and barely any medical supplies. When they finally surrendered to the Arab Legion, Jerusalem's Jewish population was expelled from the old city for the first time in centuries. That international status, no one even mentioned it again. Meanwhile, in the Galilee and the Negev, Israeli forces began pushing back, not according to the UN plan, but according to the logic of war. By the time armistice agreements were signed in 1949, Israel controlled more land than the partition had offered, about 78% of mandatory Palestine. The Arab state envisioned in the plan never materialized. Jordan annexed the West Bank, Egypt took control of Gaza, and the Palestinian people found themselves without a country, trapped in refugee camps, and caught in the crossfire of a war they didn't start but could never escape. And yet through it all, the United Nations held firm to its belief in maps. In 1949, Israel applied for UN membership. After fierce debate and no small amount of diplomatic grumbling, it was accepted. But the issue of borders was left hanging. To this day, more than 7 decades later, the final boundaries of Israel remain a subject of fierce debate. The map drawn in 1947 is now just a relic, a dream, a missed chance at a different future. And historians, perhaps unsurprisingly, still argue about it. Some say the UN plan was a noble compromise doomed by extremism. Others believe it was an imperial sleight of hand forcing incompatible visions into one boiling pot. But almost everyone agrees the plan, however well-intentioned, never stood a chance in the real world. It's a lesson as old as history. Drawing lines on paper is easy. Living peacefully on either side of them, that takes far more than a vote and a stamp. So here we are, Israel, battered and breathing, has survived its first war. It's no small feat. By the summer of 1949, a series of fragile armistice agreements are in place with Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. There are no peace treaties, just pauses. The map is redrawn not by UN cartographers, but by bullets and boots. The state of Israel is now a fact, imperfect, scarred, disputed, but real. And back in Washington, President Harry Truman is both proud and perhaps a little worn down. He's won re-election in an upset few, expected. But the emotional weight of that lunchtime signature still lingers. In private conversations, he often reflects on that moment with more humility than triumph. After all, he didn't do it for applause. There wasn't any. Recognition of Israel didn't win him love in the Arab world, nor did it make him a hero among all American Jews, many of whom were still wary of the costs ahead. What it did, Truman would later say, was simply affirm a truth that had been too long denied, that a people persecuted across centuries had a right to self-determination. But if Truman thought that his early recognition would cement an easy alliance between Israel and the United States, he would quickly learn otherwise. In fact, for much of the 1950s, the US-Israel relationship was lukewarm at best. Truman's successor, Dwight D. Eisenhower, kept Israel at arm's length. He feared antagonizing Arab nations during the Cold War. The CIA focused more on courting Middle Eastern monarchies than deepening ties with the Jewish state. Military aid to Israel was minimal. The special relationship as we know it today hadn't yet formed. Still, Israel looked west for support, and over time, as the Cold War deepened and Soviet influence spread through Egypt and Syria, Washington began to see Israel not as a liability, but as a strategic asset. But this isn't a story about geopolitics, it's about one moment. One morning, one piece of paper, and the man who signed it. Harry Truman wasn't an obvious hero in the story of Israel's creation. He wasn't a scholar of Zionism. He didn't read the Torah. He wasn't deeply invested in the region's history. But he was a man with a sense of timing, conviction, and a remarkable ability to act when others hesitated. And on May 14, 1948, he did exactly that. He never visited Israel. He never held a parade for himself. He didn't brag about that signature. But decades later, when he met Israel's first president, Chaim Weizmann, the two men stood together for a quiet photo. Truman, by then long out of office, told a friend afterward, "I am proud. I am proud of my part in the creation of this state." And Weizmann, he once said, "He is the only man in the world who did something real for my people." Here's a curious little coda to all of this. In 1961, when Truman visited the newly opened Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, a rabbi introduced him to the crowd as the man who helped create the State of Israel. Truman, never one for humility, corrected him. What do you mean, helped to create? I am Cyrus. He was referring, of course, to Cyrus the Great, the Persian king who allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. It was a cheeky comparison, but not entirely inaccurate, because, like Cyrus Truman, didn't have to do it. He wasn't Jewish. He had no political debt to the Zionist cause. He could have taken the cautious path, the delayed memo, the diplomatic wait and see, but he didn't. That moment, in all its quiet defiance, changed the course of the 20th century. It didn't end the conflict, it didn't guarantee peace, but it lit a fuse that still burns today in maps, speeches, negotiations, and war zones. And somewhere tucked in a file or resting in a museum drawer sits that letter, creased, yellowing, but intact. One page, 11 minutes, and the birth of a nation. Now let it all grow quiet. Let the sirens fade, the rifles cool, the speeches drift away like smoke in the Mediterranean breeze. The crowds outside the Tel Aviv Museum are long gone. The sandbags at the city gates have been replaced by sidewalks and cafes. The basement where Ben-Gurion typed his dream into reality now welcomes school tours and curious travelers. History has exhaled. You're no longer standing on the edge of war watching messengers race against time. You're not hunched over a typewriter or squinting at a hand-drawn map or pacing in the Oval Office while the world holds its breath. That day has passed, and though its echoes still ring in modern headlines and quiet prayers, it belongs to the past now, to museums and dusty archives and stories like this one. Because for every moment when the world teeters on the brink, there's also a moment when someone somewhere chooses to act not with thunder, but with ink, not with armies, but with recognition. Drift back from the desert winds and the marble columns of diplomacy, back from the crowded hallways of history, back into your bed, your blanket, your breath. Let your thoughts settle like dust on an empty road, and your pulse soften with the rhythm of a fan in the distance. This moment is yours. A quiet night, a peaceful room. A long story now finished. Tomorrow will come as it always does. But for now, sleep. You've crossed enough time zones for one night.